The sound of the hammer sealing the coffin was the sound of an era ending. In a single night, Isis lost everything. Her husband murdered, her kingdom usurped, and the perfect cosmic order thrown into chaos. From the queen of a prosperous Egypt, she became a hunted widow, forced to flee from her own brother, the new tyrant who had stained the throne red with blood. Her world had collapsed, but in the ashes of that ultimate grief, an iron will was forged. This is not the story of an ending. It is the story of what came next. How does a wife reclaim her husband when he is not merely dead, but torn into 14 pieces and scattered across the kingdom? How does a lone mother hide and nurture a future king in the very heart of enemy territory? This is a journey through the darkest swamps, an impossible quest, and a lesson in magic so resilient it can reverse fate itself. Imagine a world where the sun god Ra sailed across the sky in his bark of millions of years, where the Nile brought life and where magic was as real as the desert sand. This was ancient Egypt, a civilization born of mysteries and grand narratives, a world defined by one core concept, Ma'at. This wasn't just a word. It was the cosmic order, the truth, justice, and harmony. It was the fragile balance that kept the universe running. Its opposite was Isfet, chaos, violence, lies, and the unraveling of all things. The entire existence of Egypt was an eternal struggle to uphold Ma'at and fight back Isfet. And at the very heart of this cosmic struggle, at the very center of these stories, stood Isis. Her name, Aset in Egyptian, was written with the hieroglyph of a throne. This was no coincidence. She didn't just sit on the throne. She was the throne. She was the wellspring of all royal power, the divine legitimization from which the pharaohs ruled. In the beginning there was only none, the primordial, chaotic, dark abyss. From it, Adam, or Ra-Adam, willed himself into existence. By his will, he created the first pair, Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. Shu and Tefnut then birthed Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. Geb and Nut fell desperately in love, locked in a permanent embrace. But Adam-Ra commanded Shu to separate them. Shu pushed Nut high above, forming the vault of the heavens, while Geb lay below, forming the earth. The pain of their separation was eternal. Nut still weeps for Geb, and her tears fall as rain. From this tragic yet fertile union, 4 children were born, the 4 pillars of the world to come: Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. Osiris was the eldest, the god of life, rebirth, and the embodiment of the fertile black land, Kemet, gifted by the Nile. He was the destined ruler, a benevolent king. Next was Isis, the mistress of magic, Weret Hekau. She didn't just use magic. She embodied Heka, the primordial creative force the gods used to shape reality. She was wisdom, protection, and healing. She was the ideal wife and mother. Then came Seth, the god of Deshret, the red land of the desert. He was the storm, the chaos, the necessary violence. Seth was not purely evil. It was he who stood on the prow of Ra's bark every night, using his spear to strike down Apep, the great serpent of chaos. He was strength, rawness, and the necessary opposition to Osiris's civilized order. And finally, Nephthys, the lady of the house, a mysterious figure of the twilight, mirroring Isis, but also tied to darkness and mourning. Of these 4, 2 were destined for each other. Isis married her brother, Osiris. In the eyes of the ancient Egyptians, this wasn't an act of incest, but a sacred mirroring of the divine order, a way to keep the divine bloodline pure, undiluted by the mortal. Their marriage was more than a partnership. It was a cosmic alignment. Osiris, wise and benevolent, ascended to the throne of Egypt, ushering in an unprecedented golden age, Under his rule, Egypt flourished. Osiris wasn't just a king, he was a teacher. He traveled the land, teaching humanity, then still savage, living as cannibals, the arts of civilization. He taught them how to read the stars, to know when the Nile would flood, how to dig canals, how to plant wheat and barley. He taught them how to harvest, how to thresh grain, and most importantly, how to make bread and beer, the two pillars of Egyptian life. He brought them law, order, music, and religion. He was the culture bringer, the one who turned wandering tribes into a great nation. And by his side always was Isis. She was no silent queen, no mere royal ornament. She was his intellectual and magical equal. While Osiris taught the men to farm the fields, Isis taught the women how to grind the corn, to knead the dough, to weave the linen, and to run a household. She taught them the spells of healing, how to protect their children from snakes and scorpions, and the rituals to ensure a safe birth. She was the patron of women, the protector of the family. Her very image spoke volumes, often depicted with a throne on her head, signifying her royal connection, or with majestic wings, symbolizing her protective embrace. She was the divine protector of the pharaohs, the fount of their legitimacy. Pharaohs saw in her the ultimate mother, the one who cradled the future king, ensuring the continuity of their sacred lineage. She was, in essence, the silent power behind the throne, the cosmic weaver of destiny. Together, Isis and Osiris represented harmony, fertility, and the perfect balance of cosmic order, Ma'at itself. Their love story wasn't just a romance, it was the bedrock of a thriving civilization, a symbol of the perfect union between masculine and feminine principles, ensuring the very pulse of life. The land rejoiced, the people prospered, and the divine couple reigned supreme, seemingly untouchable. Their happiness was the world's happiness, but even in the brightest sunshine, shadows lurk. And for Osiris and Isis, that shadow was Seth, their brother. Seth watched. From his barren red desert lands, he watched Osiris's black fertile land bloom. He heard the songs of praise for Osiris. He saw the adoration the people held for his brother. The peaceful reign of Osiris was, to Seth, a personal affront. It was a testament to his own perceived inadequacy. Osiris was order, agriculture, life. Seth was chaos, infertility, and tempestuous strength. In a world defined by Osiris's Ma'at, Seth's role, the cosmic warrior, seemed forgotten on earth. A festering jealousy, a venomous resentment began to curdle in Seth's heart. His ambition knew no bounds, and his heart was consumed by a desire for power. Why Osiris? Why not him, the stronger, the warrior? That jealousy twisted into hatred, and that hatred birthed a plan. The betrayal, when it came, was as cunning as it was brutal. It was not an armed assault on a battlefield, but an act of duplicitous treachery veiled in celebration. Seth announced a grand feast in Osiris's honor. He invited the gods and nobles from all of Egypt. Music played, wine flowed, and food was abundant. Amidst the revelry, Seth brought forth a thing of beauty, a magnificent chest made from rare, imported cedar, exquisitely inlaid with gold, lapis lazuli, and turquoise. It was a masterpiece, a coffer so splendid that all the guests gasped in admiration. "I will gift this opulent chest," Seth announced with a theatrical smile, "to whoever fits inside it perfectly." This, of course, was the trap. Seth, in secret, had the chest crafted to Osiris's exact measurements. One by one, the guests, laughing and merry with wine, took their turn. One was too tall, another too short. One was too wide. None could match its dimensions. Finally, Osiris, unsuspecting and jovial, stepped forward. He was the guest of honor. He would try. He stepped into the chest and lay down. It fit like a second skin. The moment Osiris lay down, a smile still on his lips, Seth and his 72 conspirators slammed the lid shut. The heavy thud echoed through the hall, silencing the music. Before Osiris could even register the betrayal, before Isis could scream, the nails were hammered home. The sound of hammers striking wood was the death knell of an era. To be certain, Seth ordered molten lead poured into the seams, sealing the chest hermetically, turning it into an inescapable coffin. The beautiful coffer was now Osiris's prison. In the horrified silence of the party, Seth and his accomplices heaved the heavy chest from the palace. They carried it to the banks of the Nile. With a roar of triumph, Seth used his immense chaotic strength to hurl the coffin into the churning waters. Osiris, the beloved king, the god of life, was drowned, entombed in the very river that gave life to his kingdom. This wasn't just a regicide. It was a catastrophic disruption of Ma'at chaos threatened to engulf Egypt. Instantly, the land felt it. The sky darkened. A hot desert wind, the breath of Seth, blew across the fields, withering the crops. The Nile, defiled by the crime, grew angry. Seth's act of fratricide was a declaration of war against harmony. A challenge to the very fabric of existence, Seth installed himself on the throne, a tyrant sitting on his murdered brother's seat. And in the ruined banquet hall, amid the chilling silence, Isis stood. Her idyllic life was shattered. The husband she adored, the king she ruled beside, was gone. Her grief was immeasurable, a wound that pierced her very soul. But as her first agonizing cry tore through the night, a sharp, piercing wail of a kestrel, it was not just the sound of despair. It was the sound of an oath. It was the sound of the divine wife being thrust into action, her immense powers now called upon to confront the ultimate betrayal and restore balance to a fractured world. That new reality began in a ruined banquet hall, in a silence so profound it was a void, a vacuum that threatened to suck all of Ma'at into its cold emptiness. Seth, the usurper, sat on the throne, his reign beginning not with proclamation, but with the deafening sound of a brother's final, unheard plea. In the ruined hall, Isis stood frozen, the world's axis having shifted beneath her feet. But this stasis lasted only a moment. The initial shock, the paralyzing cold horror, gave way to a fire. It was not the warm fire of life, but the white-hot inferno of grief forged into purpose. Her grief was not a passive thing. It was an active, violent force. She cried out, and the cry itself was a spell, a wave of power that rippled across the land. She tore at her royal linens, not in despair, but in a ritual of mourning that was also a declaration of war. She ripped her finery, casting aside the identity of the serene queen, and in its place rose the divine wife, the widow, the avenger. She smeared her face with ash and dirt, binding her hair in the manner of a mourner, but her eyes burned with an unholy resolve she would find him. Seth had cast him into the Nile, but the Nile was her domain as much as it was anyone's. She would bring him back. Her love for Osiris was a force strong enough to challenge the very grip of death, and now it gave her wings, literally. Isis, the mother of magic, called upon her deepest Heka. She transformed. Her body shimmered, her arms elongating into vast pinions, her skin hardening into feathers. She became a Jarret, a divine kestrel, a majestic falcon whose cry is a piercing, mournful wail. Her powerful wings beat against the air as she embarked on her desperate quest. She soared over the vast landscapes of Egypt. She flew low over the Nile, her keen kestrel eyes scanning the winding, muddy currents, searching for the glint of gold or the dark wood of the chest. She scoured the reed beds of the delta, her shadow a fleeting cross upon the green marshes. She cried out, her lament echoing across the land, a sound that stirred the hearts of all who heard it. This transformation wasn't merely symbolic, it was an act of profound magic, allowing her to cover immense distances, to see with unparalleled clarity, and to embody the swift, decisive action that her tragic circumstances demanded. Her unwavering devotion was now fully ignited, a burning flame that would guide her through the darkest hours. She searched for days, then weeks, then months. The chest was nowhere to be found. The currents of the Nile had been swift, carrying their grim burden out of the black land of Kemet entirely. The river had emptied its tragic secret into the Wajwer, the great green, the vast and terrifying expanse of the Mediterranean Sea. Yet Isis did not falter. Her magic, intertwined with her love, acted as a compass. She could feel a faint, cold thread of Osiris's fading essence, pulling her north, beyond the shores of Egypt. She flew for leagues upon leagues over the wine-dark sea until she reached the distant coast of Phoenicia to the great port city of Byblos. In modern-day Lebanon here, the trail ended, but the story had taken a strange turn. The coffin containing Osiris's body had indeed washed ashore, but as it rested on the beach, a miracle had occurred. A tiny tamarisk sapling, finding nourishment in the divine magic radiating from the sealed chest, sprang up. It grew with supernatural speed, enveloping the coffin within its trunk, growing into a magnificent, colossal tree, the likes of which had never been seen. The fragrance that emanated from its bark was so sweet, so divine, that it perfumed the entire city. The local king, Malcander, was so struck by the tree's beauty and its scent that he ordered it cut down. Unaware of the sacred burden it held within, he had it fashioned into a massive central pillar to support the roof of his new palace. And so, Osiris, the dead king of Egypt, lay entombed for a second time, not in a river, but within the heart of a foreign king's hall. Isis, guided by her relentless will and magical perception, eventually traced the faint essence to the very gates of Byblos. She collapsed in exhaustion and grief, her divine form shrouded in the rags of a weary, aged traveler. She sat by the city's well, the traditional place for news and gathering, her face veiled, weeping silently. She did not have to wait long. The handmaidens of Queen Astarte, in some versions the queen herself, came to the well to draw water. They were struck by the mysterious noble bearing of the old woman and by the divine ambrosia that seemed to emanate from her, a scent that oddly mirrored the palace pillar. Isis, in her wisdom, befriended them. She used her magic subtly, braiding their hair in such a way that it held the perfumed scent of the gods. When they returned to the palace, Queen Astarte was enchanted. She summoned the mysterious old woman and, moved by her quiet dignity, offered her a place in the palace. She would be the nursemaid to the queen's infant son, Prince Dictys or Demophoon. Isis accepted. Her role as nursemaid allowed her to search the palace, and she quickly located her husband inside the great pillar of the hall. To repay the queen for her hospitality, Isis decided to grant the little prince the gift of immortality. Every night she secretly performed a ritual of purification with fire, burning away the child's mortal part. However, Queen Astarte had been watching, and upon seeing her son in the flames, she screamed in terror, breaking the ritual. At that moment, Isis revealed her true divine form. "Your fear has robbed your son of his immortality," she declared. "Now give me back what I came to find. The husband I mourned is inside that pillar." Horrified and awestruck, King Malcander immediately ordered the pillar to be taken down. The entire hall had to be supported by new beams, but he did not care. The pillar was carefully, reverently laid on the floor and split open. There it was, the magnificent inlaid chest. Isis let out a wail that mortals had never heard, a sound of such profound love and loss that it was said to have killed several of the queen's attendants from sheer terror and sorrow. She threw herself upon the chest, clawing at the wood, her tears flooding the floor. She kissed the sealed lid, whispering her husband's name over and over, her lamentations continuing for hours. Finally, her grief spent for the moment, she reclaimed her prize. King Malcander, desperate to atone, gave her one of his finest ships. Isis had the chest loaded along with the sacred tamarisk wood and set sail, leaving Byblos behind. She began her mournful journey back to Egypt, filled with a glimmer of hope. She had him, she had her husband. Now she could perform the proper rites. Now she could use her magic. She landed in Egypt under the cover of darkness. Seth was the new king, and she was a fugitive. She could not go to any of the great temples. They were all controlled by the usurper. She needed secrecy. She fled to the place she knew best, the wild, impenetrable papyrus swamps of the Nile Delta, to a mythical floating island called Chemishere, amidst the rustling reeds and the cries of wild birds. She hid the precious coffin, planning to wait until the time was right to begin the sacred, ancient rituals of rebirth. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to feel a sliver of peace. He was home. He was safe. But Seth was not merely a king. He was a hunter. He was the god of the wild, chaotic desert. And his paranoia was as vast as his ambition. He feared Isis. He feared her magic. And he feared that Osiris somehow was not truly gone. One night, Seth went out to hunt. The myth says he was hunting a great desert boar, stalking his prey by the brilliant, betraying light of a full moon. The moon, often an ally of Isis, as Thoth, the god of magic and the moon, was her ally. This night became her enemy. Seth stalked his prey through the delta marshes, a place he normally avoided, and then he saw it. The moonlight glinted off the gold inlay of the magnificent chest, hidden poorly amongst the reeds. He stopped. The boar was forgotten. A low growl rose in his throat. He approached the chest and recognized it. The trap he had so carefully laid. His plan had failed. Isis, his clever magical sister, had found Osiris. A rage unlike anything the world had ever seen consumed him. This was not the cold, calculating jealousy that had led to the banquet. This was the hot, unrestrained fury of his Isfet. If drowning hadn't been enough, if sealing him in lead hadn't been enough, then he would annihilate him. He would make it so Osiris could never be made whole again. With his bare, divine hands, Seth ripped the chest open. He pulled out the body of his brother, pale and preserved by the magic of the sea. And there, under the cold moonlight, he committed his second, more monstrous crime. He tore Osiris's body apart. This wasn't a simple cutting. It was a frenzied, hateful desecration. He dismembered his brother into 14 pieces, one for each of the nomes or provinces of Egypt, and to make his act a complete defilement of the entire nation, he took the pieces and scattered them, one by one, up and down the length of the Nile, from the burning sands of Nubia in the south to the silt of the delta in the north, and in a final act of unparalleled malice, designed to destroy Osiris's very essence of fertility and kingship, he took the most important piece, the phallus, and threw it into the Nile, where it was immediately devoured by the oxyrhynchus fish. Seth let out a roar of triumph. It was done, truly done. Osiris was not just dead, he was obliterated. He was scattered, absorbed, gone. No magic, not even Isis's, could reassemble a god from nothing. This final horrific discovery, the empty, shattered chest, pushed Isis beyond the known limits of grief. The quest she thought was over had merely entered a new, more agonizing phase. The quest not just to find a body, but to reassemble a god from scattered fragments, to defy an evil that sought not just to murder, but to erase. The sight of the splintered, empty chest was the final breaking point. The hope that had carried Isis across the sea from Byblos, the fragile relief she had felt upon returning to Egyptian soil, shattered into a million pieces, just as her husband's body had been. This was a desecration beyond comprehension. It was an act not just of murder, but of annihilation. Seth hadn't just killed Osiris. He had tried to erase him from existence, to deny him any chance of an afterlife, to scatter his very being so completely that not even a god could be made whole. For a long moment, Isis did nothing. She simply stood in the desolate swamp, the silence broken only by the buzzing of insects and the rustle of reeds. The moon, which had betrayed her, now shone down on her with cold indifference, illuminating the scene of her ultimate failure. This was a grief deeper than the Nile, emptier than Seth's desert. It was the absolute, crushing weight of impossibility. But Isis was the mistress of magic, and magic is the art of making the impossible possible. The void that Seth had created in her heart, in the world, began to fill. It filled with a power that was older than grief and stronger than death. It was the unshakable primeval force of Heka, mingled with a wife's undying love. She let out a sound that was not a wail, but a roar. It was a vow Seth wanted to scatter her husband across 14 gnomes. Then she would walk all 14. He wanted to tear him to pieces. She would bind every last one he wanted to erase him. She would make him eternal. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was a pilgrimage of recreation. She was not alone. The sheer cosmic horror of Seth's act had caused a rift in the divine order. Nephthys, lady of the house, sister to both Isis and Osiris, and wife to Seth himself, had seen what her husband had done. She had witnessed his mad, triumphant rage. The bond she had with her chaotic husband was shattered by this final, unforgivable act against their brother Torn. Between her loyalty as a wife and her duty as a sister, she chose blood. She chose Maat. Nephthys fled Seth's palace of storms and sought out her sister. She found Isis in the delta, a broken figure illuminated by the cruel moon. Without a word, Nephthys, the goddess of mourning in the dusk, knelt beside Isis, the goddess of magic in the throne, and offered her hand. An alliance was forged in shared sorrow. They were the Jurdi, the two kites, the two divine mourners. Isis, the active force, the light. Nephthys, the passive protector, the dark together. They would be unstoppable. And so, the great search began. It was the most perilous and heart-wrenching quest imaginable. The two sisters, often transforming into kestrels or swallows, took to the skies, their mournful cries echoing from the quarries of Aswan to the shores of the Mediterranean. They scoured the vast and treacherous landscape of Egypt, their footsteps echoing with a desperate determination. This was not a simple scavenger hunt. It was an agonizing ritual. Every gnome held a piece of their beloved brother, and finding each fragment was both a victory and a fresh trauma. Imagine them, wading through the thick crocodile-infested mud of the Nile banks. They followed herons, they questioned the fish, they listened to the whispers of the wind. Isis used every ounce of her magical power, her keen senses, and her profound intuition to locate each precious piece. In the south, near the first cataract, they found a leg. In the dense fields of the delta, they found an arm. In the sacred city of Abydos, a place destined to become the center of his cult, they found his head. With every discovery, the two sisters would perform the first desperate rites. Isis would hold the severed, decaying flesh, weeping tears that were said to be so potent, so full of sorrow and life-giving magic, that they caused the annual life-giving flood of the Nile. Her sorrow literally brought life to Egypt, even as she mourned its dead king Nephthys. The mourner would wrap the piece in clean linen, her chants protecting it from further decay, her presence shielding it from Seth's lingering malevolent influence. This was the birth of mummification. It was not a practice invented by mortals. It was a divine act of love and desperation, performed by two sisters trying to piece their brother, their world, back together. The search was long and fraught with peril. Seth's power was now supreme on earth. His spies were everywhere. Demons born of the desert storms hunted the sisters. They hid in the homes of poor fishermen, who, recognizing the divine grief of the goddesses, offered them what little shelter and bread they had. Isis, in her gratitude, blessed them, making her a goddess of the common people, not just of the pharaohs. She was the one who understood loss, the one who walked among mortals in her darkest hour. One by one, the pieces were found. 13 times they endured the horror and the relief. They found the torso, the hands, the feet. They carefully reassembled what they could, preserving each part with magic, linen, and natron. They had 13 pieces, a broken, incomplete, but recognizable form of the great god Osiris. But there was one piece missing, the 14th piece, the most vital piece for the creation of an heir. They searched the Nile from end to end. Isis transformed into a fish herself, swimming through the murky depths, calling out for her husband's seed, but it was in vain. The Oxyrhynchus fish, along with 2 other species, had devoured the phallus. This was Seth's masterstroke. Even if Isis found the rest of the body, she could never conceive the son who was destined to avenge him. The royal line was severed. Chaos had truly won. Isis and Nephthys brought the 13 pieces of Osiris to a final secret hiding place, a hidden islet in the swamps. Nephthys stood guard, her dark wings spread wide, weeping, her role as mourner now seemingly permanent. Isis looked at the incomplete body of her husband. She had defied kings, crossed seas, and scoured an entire nation. She had faced the darkest magic of her brother, and now she was stopped by a fish. For any other being, this would have been the end. The quest was a failure, but Isis was not any other being. She was Weret Hekau, the great of magic. She was the one who knew the hidden name of Ra, the one whose spells could bind the gods themselves. If the world would not provide her with what she needed, she would create it. The culmination of her quest was perhaps the most astonishing display of divine power and unwavering love in all of Egyptian mythology. She didn't let the missing part deter her. With her unparalleled mastery of magic, she fashioned a new one. She gathered mud from the Nile, the fertile silt that Osiris himself represented. She mixed it with gold, the incorruptible flesh of the gods, and waxed the substance of transformation. Then, through powerful incantations, ancient rituals, and the sheer, unadulterated force of her will, she reassembled her husband's body. She took the 13 sacred pieces wrapped in linen by her sister. She attached her magical golden and mud creation. This was not a mere embalming. This was an act of divine recreation. She was inventing the rites of mummification not for a dead king, but for a god she intended to revive. She anointed him with sacred oils. She spoke the words of power. She wrapped him in the final bandages, creating the first Sa, the first noble mummy. He was whole again, made whole by her magic and her refusal to accept defeat. But he was still dead, a perfect, complete, but lifeless vessel. Now the true magic would begin. This was not about bringing Osiris back to his throne in the land of the living. Seth's act had been too complete for that. The physical world was lost to him, but Isis was not aiming for the physical world. She was aiming for something far more important, one more moment, one more breath, one more union. She was aiming for an heir, drawing upon her boundless magical energy. Isis once again transformed. She became the kestrel, the divine bird of prey. She hovered above the inert, mummified form of her husband. She fanned her great, majestic wings, beating them rhythmically. This was not just a gesture of mourning. It was an act of profound, life-giving magic. With every downstroke, her wings pushed the breath of life itself, her own Heka, her own spirit, into his cold, bandaged lips. She breathed life back into Osiris. His eyes, closed in death, snapped open, but they did not see the world of the living. They saw the twilight realm of the Duat, the underworld. He was revived but only partially suspended between life and death by the sheer power of his wife's love. This extraordinary act was driven by a singular, profound purpose. In that moment of temporary revival, in that sacred, magical union that bridged the realms of the living and the dead, Horus was conceived. It was a mystical conception, a miracle born not of flesh, but of pure magic, enduring loyalty, and the absolute refusal of a goddess to let evil have the final say. This mystical conception was the ultimate act of the divine wife, a victory of magic and love over death itself. But this triumph immediately gave way to a new urgent reality. The Avenger had been created, but now the mother of all kings had to ensure he would survive long enough to claim his birthright. The grieving widow was gone, and in her place the protective mother rose. The magical union was complete. The future had been secured. But the cost was the final true departure of Osiris. His mummified form, having served its ultimate purpose, was now truly inert. His Ba, or spirit, released from the twilight realm Isis had held him in, turned away from the land of the living. He descended into the Duat, the dark, perilous underworld. There, he would not be a victim, but a king. He would become the silent, just, and formidable ruler of the dead, the great judge who would weigh the hearts of every mortal soul. Against the feather of Maat, his role on earth was over. Isis was left alone on the muddy bank of the Nile, her kestrel wings folding back into human arms. She was, for the first time, truly a widow, but she was not truly alone. Within her, a new life was growing. Horus, the Avenger, the rightful king, the son of the divine wife, the child of a magical miracle. This realization changed everything. Her quest was no longer about resurrecting the past. It was about protecting the future. Her grief for her husband, while still a burning coal in her heart, was now overshadowed by a new, ferocious, and terrifying instinct, that of a mother. She was now the single most wanted person in Egypt. Seth, in his paranoid rage, would undoubtedly hunt for her, and for the child he must have suspected she carried a pregnant goddess. Even one as powerful as Isis was vulnerable. Her magic, so vast and cosmic, now had to be turned inward, to shield the pinprick of life that represented the only remaining hope for Maat. Her decision was immediate. She had to disappear. She fled deeper into the labyrinthine wilderness of the Nile Delta, to the legendary floating island of Chemis. This was not a place of palaces, but a place of reeds. It was a shifting secret world of papyrus thickets, so dense they formed their own land, their roots dangling in the dark, muddy water. It was a place of mist, crocodiles, and vipers. It was a place where the borders between Maat, life, water, reeds, and Isfet, chaos, predators, secrecy, were hopelessly blurred. It was the perfect hiding spot. Here, in the secretive heart of the Nile's embrace, Isis, the queen of Egypt, the mistress of magic, became a fugitive. She shed her divine radiance, cloaking herself in the guise of a poor, wandering woman. She lived among the lowest of the low, fishermen, reed cutters, and swamp dwellers. These were the people who lived on the margins, invisible to the great temples and the new tyrannical regime of Seth. They gave her shelter in their mud huts. They shared their meager scraps of fish and bread, and in return she offered them quiet blessings and healing charms. It was here, amidst the rustling reeds and the cries of wild birds, with only her sister Nephthys, and in some tales the scorpion goddess Serket, as a midwife, that Isis gave birth. It was not a birth celebrated with hymns and offerings. It was a silent, fearful, and painful birth, hidden in a papyrus blind, the mother stifling her cries so as not to alert the agents of Seth. She held him, Horus, Horsa Aset, Horus, son of Isis. He was small, vulnerable, and perfect. He was the living incarnation of her murdered husband, the vessel of all their hopes. As she held him to her breast, her love was a tangible, magical shield. This was the moment she truly became the mother of all kings. Her life in the marshes became one of constant, grinding vigilance and profound maternal dedication. Every shadow was a potential threat, every sound a possible harbinger of danger. Her divine senses, usually attuned to the music of the cosmos, were now strained, listening for the snap of a twig, the hiss of a snake, or the heavy footfall of Seth's monstrous servants. Isis, the mother of magic, now used her Heka not to resurrect gods, but to survive the day. She wove spells of concealment around their tiny, shifting patch of land, making the reeds grow thicker to hide them. She created charms of protection against the crocodiles that slid through the water just feet away. She whispered incantations to ward off the malaria-carrying mosquitoes that swarmed in the humid air. She, who had once commanded the sun, was now reduced to a mother fighting to keep her baby safe from insects. But her greatest trial was yet to come. It was the event that would be immortalized on thousands of amulets, the Sipi of Horus. One day Isis had to leave the infant Horus alone. He was hidden, swaddled in a nest of reeds, protected by all the spells she knew. She went to the village to beg for food, her heart heavy with leaving him. When she returned, the clearing was silent, too silent. She pushed aside the papyrus stalks and her heart stopped. Horus was lying on his back, limp and blue. His limbs were cold. A faint dark mark was on his tiny body. He had been stung by a scorpion, a creature of Seth, an agent of Isfet sent to finish the job his uncle had started. This was not the noble grief she felt for Osiris. This was the raw, primal, animalistic panic of a mother. She snatched up his lifeless body and let out a scream that was not a lament, but a cosmic accusation. It was a roar of such profound agony and rage that it tore through the fabric of reality. She refused to accept this. She had not defied death, crossed the sea, reassembled her husband, and birthed a miracle just to have it stolen from her by a venomous insect. Her cry of no echoed across the heavens. It was so powerful, so filled with magical intent and maternal fury that it stopped the boat of Ra. The sun god, on his daily journey across the sky, halted. The sun ceased to move. The world was plunged into an unnatural, terrifying twilight. Time itself stood still. The cosmos would not be allowed to continue until justice was done. From the stalled bark of the sun, Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, medicine, and magic, the only one whose Heka rivaled Isis's, descended. He came to her, standing in the swamp as she cradled her dead son. "Great goddess," Thoth said, his voice the sound of dry scrolls. "Mistress of spells, who can command the very gods? What is this grief that halts the sun? "My son is dead," Isis shrieked, her divine power flaring, causing the very water in the swamp to boil. "Seth has struck again. The heir is dead. Mayat is dead. Let the world end." Thoth looked at the child and knew this was a turning point for all existence. "He is not dead, not yet," Thoth said, "but the poison is deep. Your power alone, born of grief, is not enough. But my power, born of knowledge, combined with yours, will be." Thoth taught her the great healing incantation, a spell of such potency that it could reverse any poison, heal any wound. It was a spell that invoked the power of Ra, the magic of Thoth, and the love of Isis. Isis, her voice shaking but resolute, gathered her son to her chest and spoke the words. She poured her own life force, her own divine essence into him, commanding the poison to recede, commanding his heart to beat, commanding his spirit to return to his body. Slowly warmth returned to Horus's limbs, a tiny cough, a flicker of his eyelids. He began to cry. Isis collapsed, weeping in relief, as the boat of Ra resumed its journey and the sun returned to the sky. She had done it. She had faced Isfet in its purest, most insidious form, and had won. She had looked death in the face and stared it down, not for her husband, but for her child. From that day on, her purpose was singular. She was no longer just a protector. She was a forge. She nurtured Horus in the harsh wilderness, feeding him not just her milk, but her magic, her stories, her strength. She told him of his father, Osiris, the benevolent king. She told him of his uncle, Seth, the murderer. She taught him that his life was not his own. It was a debt. He was Mat's avenger. The forging of the avenger was complete. Years of hiding, healing, and teaching in the desolate swamps had tempered Horus into a warrior, his heart filled with his mother's magic and her unshakable thirst for justice. The time for secrecy was over. The time for open confrontation had arrived. The battle for the throne would now move from the shadows of the Delta to the great halls of the gods themselves. The days of hiding in the papyrus swamps of Chemis were over. The vulnerable infant that Isis had shielded with her own body and magic was gone, and in his place stood a god Horus had grown, nurtured by his mother's magic, and steeled by her stories of betrayal. He was no longer a secret to be kept, but a weapon to be unleashed. His eyes, sharp and clear like the falcon he embodied, were fixed on one goal, the throne. The time had come not just to avenge a father, but to reclaim a kingdom and restore the very fabric of Ma'at. The contendings of Horus and Seth, the great divine conflict for the soul of Egypt, was not merely a war of swords and spears. It was, first and foremost, a legal battle, a cosmic lawsuit argued before the Ennead, the great tribunal of the gods. At its head sat Ra-Atum, the ancient sun god, the creator, often joined by Geb, the father of Osiris, and Seth. This was where Isis's role shifted once more. She had been the divine wife, the grieving widow, and the protective mother. Now she became the royal advocate, the chief strategist, and the unshakable legal mind for her son's claim. Horus, young and fiery, made his claim. "I am the son of Osiris, the rightful king. The throne is my inheritance, stolen by my treacherous uncle Seth, who murdered my father." Seth, the god of chaos and strength, laughed. His defense was simple and brutal. "Might makes right. I am the strongest. I am the one who stands on Ra's bark and defends the sun from Apep. This boy, this child, is weak, illegitimate, and unfit to rule the throne, belongs to the one who can hold it." The tribunal was divided. Ra, the pragmatic and aging king of the gods, leaned toward Seth. He saw Horus as an unproven upstart and valued Seth's raw, violent power as essential for the cosmos' survival. Geb, The god of the earth felt the wound of his murdered son, Osiris, and favored his grandson, Horus. The other gods were split, and thus began a legal and magical war that would rage, according to the text, for 80 years. 80 years of arguments, of trials, of magical duels, and celestial political maneuvering. And at the center of it all was Isis, fighting for her son with a cunning that surpassed even Seth's brute force. She was Horus's power of attorney, his chief of staff, and his most potent magical asset. Seth, furious at having to justify his reign, tried to have the case dismissed. He demanded that the trial be moved to a remote island, and he extracted a promise from the Ennead. The ferryman, a minor god named Anti, was to be forbidden, under penalty of death, from transporting any woman who resembled Isis. He would isolate Horus from his greatest asset. It was a clever move, but Seth, god of chaos, could never outwit the mistress of magic. Isis simply transformed herself into a weary old woman. She walked inland and set her trap. She transformed again. The old crone melted away. In her place stood the single, most beautiful woman Seth had ever seen, young, with a body that promised paradise, her face veiled in alluring mystery. She sat beneath a sycamore tree and began to weep, her sobs delicate and heartbreaking. Seth, wandering the island, heard the sound and was drawn to it. He saw the vision of beauty and was instantly captivated. "My dear," he boomed, trying to sound gentle, "what causes such sorrow for one so beautiful?" Isis, in disguise, looked up, her eyes wide with carefully crafted fear and loss. "Oh, my lord," she whispered, "I am a widow. My dear husband, he was a herdsman. We had a fine herd of cattle. But he died, and now a wicked, cruel stranger has come to my home. He has beaten my son. He has stolen our entire herd, and he has cast my son out, leaving him with no inheritance. My lord, who will right this wrong for a poor widow and her dispossessed son?" Seth's face purpled with rage. His entire identity was based on strength and dominance. The idea of a strong man preying on a weak widow and child while hypocritically being exactly what he had done offended his sense of order. "This is an outrage," Seth roared, his voice the sound of thunder. "This wicked stranger must be punished. The son's inheritance must be restored to him, and the thief cast out. I, Seth, swear it." In that instant, the beautiful woman vanished. A kestrel shrieked with laughter and flew into the branches of the tree. Then the bird transformed, and Isis, the divine wife, in her full divine majesty, looked down on him. "You have judged yourself with your own mouth, son of Nut," she cried. "With your own words, you have condemned your own crime. You have declared that the son, Horus, my son, son of Osiris, must have his inheritance." Seth howled in fury. Realizing he had been tricked, Isis immediately flew to the Ennead and repeated the entire story, word for word. "Even Seth agrees," she proclaimed. "The son's inheritance must be restored." The gods roared with laughter. Seth was humiliated. The scales of justice tipped heavily in Horus's favor, but the war was far from over. Humiliated, Seth abandoned legal strategy and turned to depravity. His new plan was simple. He would prove Horus was unfit to rule by publicly dominating him, by asserting his masculine power over him in the most degrading way possible. He would treat Horus not as a rival, but as a female, a receptive partner. He invited Horus to his palace, feigning a desire for truce. "Come," he said, "let us spend the night in peace and end this quarrel." Horus, young and perhaps too trusting, agreed. That night Seth harmed his nephew. He intended to appear before the tribunal the next day and claimed that he had dominated Horus, proving his superiority and Horus's unfitness to be king. But Seth had once again forgotten who Horus's mother was. Isis, her maternal intuition sensing a terrible danger, had followed her son. When she realized what Seth had done, she didn't panic. She acted. Before Seth's semen could be absorbed, she rushed to her son and told him to cup his hands. She used her magic to draw the seed of chaos out of Horus, catching it in her hands. The physical evidence of Horus's shame, she looked at it with utter disgust. She threw it into the marsh. Her son was clean of Seth's defilement, but her counterattack had just begun. Now, she said, her voice cold as stone, we will turn his own weapon against him. She magically collected Horus's own semen. Then she went to Seth's garden, to the lettuce patch. Lettuce, a strange phallic plant that leaked a milk-like substance, was Seth's favorite food. With surgical precision, Isis spread Horus's seed over the fresh, green leaves. That evening, Seth, hungry from his exertions, went to his garden and devoured the lettuce, consuming his own nephew's seed. The next day, the divine tribunal convened. Seth, arrogant and triumphant, stepped forward. The case is closed, he announced. I have dominated Horus. I have proven his unfitness. He is no king. The gods murmured in shock. Horus shrank in shame, but Isis stepped forward, her eyes blazing. Let us test this claim, Lord of Chaos. Let us call upon the seed of the gods and see where it lies. Thoth, god of wisdom and magic, stepped forward to officiate. I call upon the seed of Seth, he intoned. The Ennead waited, and from the murky, muddy river outside the hall, a faint voice answered, Here I am. The gods gasped, then erupted in laughter. Seth's seed was in the river. His attempt at domination had failed, ending in the mud. He had been tricked. Seth turned pale, realizing he had been outmaneuvered, but Isis was not finished. Thoth, at her prompting, raised his staff again. I call upon the seed of Horus. The hall fell silent, and from inside Seth, from the depths of his own stomach, a voice answered, Here I am. A golden divine disk, the seed of Horus, emerged from the crown of Seth's head, a blinding radiant light. The ultimate humiliation was complete. Seth, the hypermasculine god, had been impregnated by his nephew. It was Horus who had dominated Seth. The case was all but won. Seth, utterly defeated in magic, law, and now personal honor, was disgraced. The Ennead was ready to rule. But the conflict had one final physical test, a race in boats made of stone. Seth, using his immense strength, tore the top off a mountain and fashioned a massive stone boat. Horus, guided by his mother's cunning, took pine wood, plastered it with chalk and gypsum to look exactly like stone, and launched it. The race began. Seth's massive stone boat, true to its nature, sank like a rock. Horus, in his fake stone boat, sailed easily. Furious at being tricked again, Seth transformed into a hippopotamus, attacking Horus's boat. But Horus was ready. He repelled him with his harpoon, and the race was called in his favor. After 80 years, the verdict was clear. The gods, weary of the conflict, and with a final threatening letter from Osiris himself, who warned he would unleash the dead from the underworld if his son was not given the throne, ruled unanimously. Horus was the rightful king of Upper and Lower Egypt. With Horus's coronation, the 80-year war was over. Isis had won. Her son sat on the throne. Her husband was avenged, and her name was seared into the cosmos. But this victory was not merely an end. It was the establishment of a new cosmic and political order, a divine charter that would define Egypt for millennia and cement the legacy of its greatest goddess. The ascension of Horus to the throne of Egypt was not an end, but a beginning. It was the first time, the Zeptepi, the mythical age when gods ruled directly on earth, establishing the divine template for all of human civilization to follow. The cosmic order, Ma'at, which had been violently shattered by Seth's fratricide, was finally painstakingly restored. But it was a new order, one forged in loss and tempered by magic. The universe now had two kings. In the world of the living, the land of Kemet, Horus the Younger sat on the throne. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt united on his brow. He was the living pharaoh, the avenger, the embodiment of a just and rightful rule. In the silent twilight realm of the Duat, the underworld, Osiris the mummified king reigned supreme. He was the Lord of the dead, the great judge, the promise of eternity. Father and son now ruled their respective interconnected kingdoms. Life and death were in perfect divine balance. And what of Seth, the god of chaos? He was not destroyed. He could not be. The ancient Egyptians, in their profound wisdom, understood that chaos, Isfet, is not an evil to be annihilated, but a force to be contained. It is a necessary part of the cosmos, the raw, untamed energy against which order defines itself. Seth, defeated and disgraced, was ultimately reconciled. His ferocious power was given a new purpose. He was exiled from the throne of Egypt, but restored to his original cosmic role. Standing on the prow of Ra's sunboat, his red eyes piercing the darkness, his spear ready. Every night as Ra sailed through the underworld, the great serpent Apep would attack, and every night Seth, the killer, the chaos god, would be the only one strong enough to repel him, ensuring the sun would rise again. Balance was restored. Even the murderer had his necessary place. And Isis? Her journey, the agonizing epic of the divine wife and the protective mother, was complete. Her husband was avenged. Her son was king. She was no longer a fugitive, a widow, or a frantic mother. She was now the Mut Nesut, the king's mother, the matriarch of the gods, the dowager queen of the cosmos. She became the eternal patron of the pharaohs. Her story was no longer just a myth. It was the foundational charter for all of Egyptian kingship. From that moment on, every pharaoh who sat on the throne was the living incarnation of Horus. When he died, he became Osiris. And the queen, the one who gave birth to the new king, was the living embodiment of Isis. The great royal wife of Egypt was Isis, and the throne she sat upon was the literal lap of the goddess. Nurturing the future of the nation, Isis was the divine source of all royal legitimacy, the magic that bound the human king to the divine realm. Her cult, already widespread from her days as a healer in the Delta, exploded in popularity. She became the most beloved, most personal, and most powerful goddess in the entire pantheon. Other gods were distant, cosmic, and often frightening. Ra was the sun, but he was ancient and remote. Seth was the storm to be appeased. Osiris was the king of the dead to be revered. But Isis had suffered. People didn't just worship Isis, they related to her. Every wife who had lost a husband understood her. Every mother who had feared for her child, who had sat up all night with a sick infant, saw herself in Isis. Every person who had been wronged by someone stronger, who had been cheated of their inheritance, prayed to her. She was the goddess of the oppressed, the healer, the magician, the protector of the family. She was the one who had faced the absolute worst the cosmos could throw at her. Betrayal, loss, dismemberment, the death of her child, and she had won. She offered not just divine power, but hope. This universal personal appeal is the heart of her legacy. It's what allowed her to transcend her own culture and become one of the most widely revered deities of the entire ancient world. As Egypt's power waned and the sands shifted, her story was too compelling to be contained by the Nile Valley. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, the Greeks were mesmerized by her. They saw in her their own goddess Demeter, the grieving mother who searched the underworld for her lost daughter, Persephone. They saw her as a wiser, more powerful Aphrodite, a goddess of love who was not fickle but eternally loyal. But it was the Romans who truly took her global. As the Roman Empire expanded, they absorbed the gods of their conquered territories, and they fell in love with Isis. Her cult spread like wildfire, from the streets of Pompeii, where her temple was one of the first and most beautifully restored, after the earthquake of 62 AD, to the cold, damp fringes of the empire in London. She became a universal goddess, Isis Panthea, Isis the all-goddess. Sailors prayed to her as Isis Pelagia, Isis of the sea, protector of their voyages, her magic holding back the storms of Seth. Her mysteries of Isis became one of the most popular and profound mystery cults in the Roman world, a direct competitor to Christianity. Initiates would undergo secret rituals, a symbolic death and rebirth, mirroring the story of Osiris. They were promised what the state gods of Rome could not offer, a personal relationship with a compassionate, forgiving goddess, and the promise of a blissful afterlife, a resurrection earned not by birth, but by devotion. Isis, the one who had brought her husband back from the dead, was the only one who could guarantee the same for her followers. And it is here, in her Roman-era incarnation, that we see her most profound and lasting influence on the future. At the very same time the cult of Isis was at its peak, a new faith was rising from the sands of Judea, Christianity. The cultural and artistic exchange was inevitable. Scholars and historians have long pointed to the undeniable and fascinating parallels. Think of the core of the Christian story: a divine mother, a miraculous conception, a divine son who is killed by the forces of chaos, and who is ultimately resurrected, conquering death and promising eternal life to his followers. The story of Isis, Osiris, and Horus is the Egyptian expression of this same powerful universal human archetype. But the most striking connection, the one that is impossible to ignore, is the iconography. The most common and beloved image of Isis in the Greco-Roman world was the Isis lactans, Isis, the divine mother, sitting on a throne, tenderly nursing her miracle child, the boy king Horus. Thousands of these statues and amulets existed. As Christianity began to spread and needed to create its own art to depict its own divine mother and child, it did not invent a new visual language. It adopted the one that was already universally understood and beloved. The earliest images of the Virgin Mary holding the infant Jesus are, in form and spirit, aesthetically identical to the images of Isis nursing Horus, the Queen of Heaven. In one faith, found her visual echo in the Queen of Heaven of the next. This is not to say they are the same figure, they are profoundly different, with unique theologies. But the archetype, the divine, compassionate, intercessory mother who protects her sacred son, is a current that flows directly from the Nile, through Rome, and into the heart of Western civilization. The motif of the divine wife, the mother of all kings, conveys timeless messages that resonate deeply even today. It speaks to the incredible power of love's triumph over adversity, reminding us that loyalty and devotion are not passive, but active, fighting forces. It illuminates the sacred foundational role of women, not just as nurturers, but as sources of wisdom, strength, magic, and authority. Isis remains an enduring symbol of empowerment. Her tale reminds us that true power often lies not in brute force, but in unwavering love, profound wisdom, and the courage to fight for what is right, no matter the cost. Her legacy is etched into the very fabric of human storytelling, a testament to the enduring human and divine spirit, a beacon of strength for all who seek to overcome adversity and protect what they hold most dear.